The fastest gun in the West made one fatal mistake. He chose the wrong man to humiliate. When notorious gunslinger Rhett Callahan rode into Red Hollow looking for his next victim, he found an old farmer who refused to break. What started as cruel mockery became something far more dangerous, a battle that would cost Rhett everything he believed about power, fear, and himself. This is the story of a legend who conquered the frontier with bullets, until he met the one man who could destroy him without firing a single shot. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The sun hadn't yet burned the frost off Red Hollow's main street when Rhett Callahan decided to ruin someone's life. It was a Tuesday, though days of the week meant nothing to a man who measured time in bodies and broken spirits. He sat outside the saloon, boots crossed on the hitching post, watching the town wake up like a predator selecting prey from a herd. At 24 years old, Rhett Callahan had killed more men than most soldiers saw in a lifetime of war. His reputation stretched across 3 territories like a shadow cast by something massive and inevitable. People spoke his name in whispers, as if saying it too loud might summon him. Towns paid him to leave. Sheriffs looked the other way. Even hardened outlaws gave him wide berth, recognizing in his cold blue eyes something fundamentally broken, something that had stopped being human somewhere along the way. He was beautiful in the way a rattlesnake is beautiful, all lethal grace and perfect design for one singular purpose. Tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in waves that women found irresistible and men found unsettling. His face would have belonged to a poet or a preacher in another life, all sharp angles and full lips that curved into a smile that never reached those ice-chip eyes. But this wasn't another life. This was the only one he'd ever known, and he'd made himself its king through violence so swift and certain it had become art. The holster on his right hip held a Colt .45 with custom grips made from the wood of a hanging tree in Dodge City. People said he'd carved them himself from the very branch where he'd watched his first man die. Rhett never confirmed or denied it. Mystery added to legend, and legend kept people afraid. Fear was his currency, and business was always good. He'd ridden into Red Hollow 3 days ago with no particular purpose except the one that drove him everywhere, to remind the world that Rhett Callahan existed, and that his existence meant everyone else's was conditional. The first night, he'd shot a card cheat through the hand, pinning him to the poker table while whiskey glasses shattered and grown men scrambled for the door. The second night, he'd beaten the blacksmith's son unconscious for looking at him wrong. Or maybe for looking at him right. Rhett couldn't remember and didn't care. But by the third morning, Red Hollow had gotten boring. People crossed the street when they saw him coming. Shopkeepers locked their doors. The saloon grew quiet when he entered. Fear had done its work too well, and now there was nothing left to break. That's when he saw the old man. Elias Varn moved through the morning crowd like water flowing around stones, present but unremarked upon, noticed by no one. He was loading seed bags into the back of a weathered wagon, his movements slow and methodical, each 50-pound sack lifted with the same careful precision as the last. He wore clothes that had been mended so many times, the original fabric was more memory than material, canvas work pants held together by hope and habit. A cotton shirt faded to the color of old bone, a wide-brimmed hat that had seen decades of sun. Everything about him whispered insignificance. He was exactly the kind of man Rhett loved to destroy. Rhett unfolded from his chair with feline ease, his spurs chiming a slow rhythm as he crossed the dirt street. A few people noticed and hurried away. Others froze, unwilling to draw attention but unable to look away from what was about to happen. The bartender, who'd been sweeping the boardwalk, quietly retreated inside and closed the door. "Morning, old-timer," Rhett called out, his voice carrying that particular drawl that made friendly words sound like threats. "That's some heavy lifting for a man your age. You sure your back can handle it?" Elias didn't look up. He positioned another seed bag on the wagon's edge, aligned it carefully with the others, and slid it into place. Then he walked back to the stack for another. The non-response made Rhett's smile sharpen. He moved closer, positioning himself directly in the old man's path. "I'm talking to you, old man. It's rude not to answer when someone's being neighborly." Elias stopped about 3 feet away. For the first time, he looked up, and Rhett found himself staring into eyes that were a startling pale gray, like winter sky before snow. The old man's face was weathered leather, creased with lines that spoke of decades under an unforgiving sun. He might have been 60 or 80, impossible to tell, but there was no tremor in his stance, no uncertainty in his gaze. "Didn't realize you were talking to me," Elias said quietly. His voice was rough from disuse, like a tool kept in a shed too long. "Thought maybe you were talking to yourself. You got that look about you." A few people gasped. You didn't talk back to Rhett Callahan. You didn't meet his eyes. You certainly didn't imply he was crazy. Rhett's hand drifted toward his holster, not threateningly, just a casual reminder of what hung there. "That's so. And what look is that exactly?" "The look of a man having a conversation nobody else can hear." Elias stepped around him and picked up another seed bag. "I got work to finish." "You got business, state it. Otherwise I'd appreciate you finding somewhere else to stand." The street had gone absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Rhett could feel eyes on him from every window, every doorway. This moment would be repeated in saloons and general stores across the territory by nightfall. How Rhett Callahan was addressed, how he responded. Reputation was built on moments exactly like this. He should have shot the old man right there, put a bullet through his knee, watched him crumble, stood over him while he begged. It's what everyone expected. It's what he'd done 100 times before in 100 different towns to 100 different men who dared to show him anything less than terror. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the old man's eyes, which held no fear but also no challenge, just a kind of patient indifference, as if Rhett were a cloud passing in front of the sun, temporary and inconsequential. Maybe it was the way he moved, with an economy of motion that suggested every gesture had been refined through endless repetition until it became as natural as breathing. Maybe it was something else entirely, something Rhett couldn't name but recognized on an instinctive level. Whatever it was, he didn't draw. Instead, he laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You got some balls on you, old man. I'll give you that." He moved closer, invading the space around the wagon. "But maybe you don't understand how things work. See, in this town, in every town from here to the Colorado border, people show me respect. Not because I'm nice, not because I deserve it, but because I'm Rhett fucking Callahan, and that name means something." Elias set down the seed bag with deliberate care. He brushed dust from his hands and finally turned to face Rhett fully. Up close, the old man was smaller than he'd seemed from a distance. Maybe 5'9", rail thin, with hands that were all bone and sinew. But he stood perfectly balanced, weight distributed evenly on both feet, and there was something about his stillness that was more unnerving than any aggressive posture could have been. "Your name," Elias said slowly, "means you've scared a lot of people into pretending you matter. That's not the same as actually mattering." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Rhett's vision narrowed. Blood rushed in his ears. His hand clenched into a fist so tight the knuckles went white. Every instinct screamed at him to hurt this man, to break him so completely that he'd never forget the price of disrespect. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, could taste copper on his tongue. "What did you just say to me?" "You heard me fine. Your ears work better than your sense." Elias picked up another seed bag. "Now, I've got 6 more of these to load, and you're wasting daylight I can't afford to waste. So unless you plan to actually do something instead of just standing there trying to scare an old man who's got better things to be scared of, I'd appreciate you moving along." Rhett's hand flashed to his gun, had it halfway out of the holster before he even realized he'd moved. The old man didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't even blink. He just stood there, seed bag in his arms, waiting. And in that moment of terrible clarity, Rhett understood that the old man genuinely didn't care whether he died right here in the street. There was no bravado in his stance, no hidden fear, no calculation. Just complete and total indifference to the threat Rhett represented. It was the most unsettling thing Rhett had ever encountered. He let the gun slide back into its holster, but his hand remained on the grip. "You got a name, old man?" "Elias Varn." "Well, Elias Varn, you just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life." Rhett's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every watching ear. "I'm going to give you until sundown tomorrow to apologize. On your knees, in front of everyone. You're going to beg me to forgive you for your disrespect. And if you do it right, if you really grovel good, maybe I'll let you keep one of your hands." Elias loaded the seed bag into the wagon. "I'll be at my farm, same as always. You know where to find me if you need something." "Oh, I'll find you." Rhett backed away, his eyes never leaving the old man's face. "Tomorrow, sundown, you be in this street, or I come to your farm and burn it to the ground with you inside." He turned and walked toward the saloon, every line of his body radiating violence barely contained. People scattered before him like starlings before a hawk. He could feel their eyes, could hear the whispers starting already. The story would spread, how Rhett Callahan had shown mercy, had given a foolish old farmer one last chance. But underneath the performance, underneath the swagger and the threats, something else was happening. Something Rhett didn't have words for and wouldn't have admitted even if he did. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain. The rest of the day passed in a blur of whiskey and mounting rage. Rhett held court in the saloon, drinking alone at a corner table while the other patrons gave him wide berth. He replayed the confrontation in his mind 100 times, each iteration stoking his fury higher. The disrespect, the audacity, the complete absence of fear. Men had died for less. Men had died for nothing at all, just for being in Rhett's way when his mood turned dark. And this old farmer, this nobody, had stood there and told him he didn't matter? He poured another whiskey with shaking hands and downed it in one burning swallow. "You all right, Mr. Callahan?" He looked up to find Jenny, one of the saloon girls, hovering at a careful distance. She was young and pretty in a tired way, with auburn hair and eyes that had seen too much too soon. Unlike the others, she'd always been kind to him, not from fear, but from some well of compassion he neither understood nor deserved. "Do I look all right?" he snarled. She didn't flinch. "You look like a man with something eating at him from the inside. That old farmer, Elias Varn. What do you know about him?" Jenny pulled out a chair and sat down, the only person in Red Hollow who would dare. "Not much. He lives out east about 5 miles, keeps to himself. Comes to town once a month for supplies. Never causes trouble, never starts conversations, just buys what he needs and leaves." "He always been here?" "Long as I've been alive, and my mother said he was here before she was born." Jenny studied him with those two knowing eyes. "Why? What'd he do?" "He disrespected me, in front of half the town." "And you let him walk away?" There was genuine surprise in her voice. Rhett's hand crashed down on the table hard enough to make the whiskey bottle jump. "I gave him a chance to make it right. Tomorrow, sundown, he apologizes or he dies. That's mercy, not weakness." But even as he said it, he knew it sounded wrong. Rhett Callahan didn't give chances. Rhett Callahan didn't show mercy. He struck like lightning, sudden, devastating, final. That was his way. That was his legend. So why had he hesitated? Jenny reached across the table and did something no one else would have dared. She touched his hand. "Can I tell you something true?" He should have pulled away, should have backhanded her for the presumption. Instead, he found himself nodding. "That old man scares you." The words hit like a physical blow. Rhett jerked his hand back, knocking over the whiskey bottle. Amber liquid flooded across the table and dripped onto the floor. "I ain't scared of nothing." The shout echoed through the suddenly silent saloon. Especially not some broken-down farmer. Jenny stood slowly, her expression sad rather than frightened. "Whatever you say, Mr. Callahan." She turned to leave, then paused. "But if you weren't scared, you would have killed him where he stood. Fear's the only thing that makes a man like you stop." She walked away before he could respond, disappearing up the stairs to the rooms where she worked. Rhett sat alone with his spilled whiskey and racing thoughts, feeling the weight of every eye in the saloon pressing against his back. He wanted to shoot someone. Needed to prove that Jenny was wrong, that he wasn't afraid, that he was still Rhett fucking Callahan, and that meant something. But the only person he really wanted to shoot was himself, and even he couldn't name why. The sun set like a wound bleeding out across the horizon. Rhett stood on the saloon balcony, watching Red Hollow settle into evening routines. Lamplighters making their rounds, shopkeepers closing up, families gathering for supper. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that tomorrow he was going to remind them all why they should live in fear. Or at least, that's what he told himself. The truth he couldn't quite grasp was simpler and more terrible. Elias Varn had looked at him and seen through him. had seen past the reputation, past the gun, past the carefully cultivated legend of death incarnate, had seen something small and hollow and desperate, trying to fill an unfillable void with violence. And worst of all, the old man hadn't cared. That was the unbearable part. Not contempt. Contempt Rhett understood. Not fear. Fear was familiar territory. But indifference. To be looked at as if you were nothing? As if your entire existence, every terrible thing you'd done, every life you'd taken, every soul you'd broken, added up to exactly zero in the grand accounting? It was worse than death. Rhett gripped the balcony railing until splinters bit into his palms. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow the old man would break, would fall to his knees and beg and confirm everything Rhett needed to believe about himself, about the world, about the natural order of predator and prey. Tomorrow, everything would go back to normal. But as night fell and stars emerged like distant accusations, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a different truth. Tomorrow, something was going to break. And it might not be Elias Varn. Rhett didn't sleep that night. He paced his rented room like a caged animal, his mind churning through scenarios. By dawn, he'd consumed half a bottle of whiskey and convinced himself that what he was feeling wasn't fear, it was excitement, the thrill of the hunt, the anticipation of watching someone break. He'd done this 1,000 times. This would be no different. He told himself that lie until he almost believed it. By noon, word had spread throughout Red Hollow and beyond. Riders had gone out to neighboring settlements, and people were streaming in to witness the spectacle. Rhett Callahan, the most feared gunslinger in 3 territories, was going to make an example of someone. It was the kind of entertainment you couldn't buy at any price. The street began filling up hours before sundown. Merchants sold food and drink from hastily arranged stalls. Mothers kept children close but brought them anyway, a lesson in what happened to those who forgot their place. Men gathered in clusters, making bets on whether the old farmer would show up at all. Rhett emerged from the saloon at 3 o'clock, impeccably dressed in black from head to toe. His gun belt gleamed with fresh oil. His boots shone. He'd shaved and combed his hair, transforming himself into the perfect image of civilized death. He took his position in the center of the street, right where the confrontation had begun, and waited. The crowd gave him a wide circle, 40 feet in every direction, the kill zone. Everyone knew that when Rhett Callahan drew, you wanted distance between yourself and his target. 4 o'clock came and went. Then 5. The sun crept toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Rhett stood motionless, a statue carved from arrogance and barely suppressed rage. His right hand hung loose by his holster, fingers occasionally flexing, rehearsing the draw he'd perfected through countless repetitions and too many deaths. "He ain't coming," someone in the crowd whispered. "Smart man," another replied. "Probably rode out last night." "No," a third voice said. Old Samuel, who ran the general store. "That ain't Elias's way. If he said he'd be at his farm, that's where he is. He don't run." Rhett's jaw clenched. The old farmer was making him look weak, making him stand here in front of everyone while the appointed time approached and his target remained absent. It was a different kind of humiliation, subtler but no less damaging to his reputation. The sun touched the horizon, 15 minutes to official sundown. "He's running out of time!" Rhett's voice cracked across the assembled crowd like a whip. "Tell your children what happens to cowards. Tell them what happens when you disrespect Rhett Callahan." 10 minutes. 5. The bottom edge of the sun kissed the earth, bleeding light across the darkening sky. Rhett could feel sweat running down his spine despite the cooling air. His hand ached from being held ready for so long. The crowd had grown restless, murmuring among themselves. Then someone shouted, "There!" Every head turned east toward the road that led to the outlying farms. A figure emerged from the settling dust, moving with that same unhurried pace Rhett remembered from yesterday morning. Elias Varn walked into Red Hollow carrying nothing but a walking staff made of plain wood, worn smooth by years of use. He wasn't running, wasn't hurrying to make the deadline, just walking at the same steady pace he probably walked everywhere, as if he had all the time in the world, and Rhett Callahan's ultimatum meant exactly as much as the old man's expression suggested. Nothing at all. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, people pressing back against buildings, and each other to clear a path. Elias walked through them without acknowledging their existence, his eyes fixed on Rhett, standing in the center of the street. He stopped about 20 feet away, not at a defensive distance, not within the kill zone, but at the exact spot where two people would naturally stand for a conversation. The walking staff planted itself in the dust with a solid thump. "You wanted me here," Elias said simply. "Here I am." Rhett's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his eyeballs. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. The old man should be terrified, should be sweating, should be begging for mercy before Rhett even opened his mouth. Instead, he stood there like he was waiting for a stagecoach, patient and unperturbed. "You know why you're here," Rhett said, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. "You know what you need to do. You want an apology." It wasn't a question. "On your knees." Elias was quiet for a moment, those winter sky eyes studying Rhett with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Then the old man shook his head slowly. "No." The single word detonated across the silence like a gunshot. The crowd gasped collectively. Someone, it might have been Jenny, made a small sound of distress. Rhett's vision tunneled until all he could see was the old man's face, calm and resolute. "What did you say?" "I said no." Elias shifted his weight slightly, settling deeper into his stance. "I didn't do anything that requires an apology. I told you the truth, that scaring people don't make you matter. Still true today as it was yesterday. So no, I won't apologize. Won't get on my knees, won't beg. If you're going to kill me, then kill me. But I ain't feeding your need to feel big." The crowd had gone so quiet that Rhett could hear his own blood rushing in his ears. Every eye was on him, waiting to see what the legendary Rhett Callahan would do when faced with such absolute defiance. His hand moved to his gun. This time he drew it fully, the Colt clearing leather with the whisper of oiled metal on leather. He thumbed back the hammer, click, click, and aimed directly at Elias Varn's chest. The old man didn't move, didn't raise his hands in surrender, didn't close his eyes, just stood there, staff in hand, waiting. "Last chance," Rhett heard himself say. "Apologize, or I'll drop you where you stand." "Then drop me." Elias's voice was quiet but carried clearly to every listener. "Pull that trigger if it makes you feel like you've won something, but we both know you already lost." "Lost? Lost?" Rhett's hand shook, making the gun barrel waver. "I'm the one holding the gun. I'm the one about to end your pathetic life. How the hell have I lost?" "Because you need me to be afraid, and I'm not." Elias took a step forward, a single step that closed the distance by 2 feet. "You need me to acknowledge your power, and I don't. You need killing me to mean something, and it won't. You can take my life, boy, but you can't take what you really want, and knowing that is eating you alive." Another step, 15 feet now, within easy range, an impossible shot to miss. "Stay back!" Rhett's shout cracked with something that might have been fear. "I'll shoot! I swear I'll—" "So shoot!" Another step, 12 feet. "Do what you do. Take what you take. Add my body to all the others, and tell yourself it makes you strong." 10 feet. Rhett's finger tightened on the trigger. One more pound of pressure, maybe less, and the gun would fire. The bullet would punch through the old man's sternum, tear through vital organs, exit out his back in a spray of blood and bone fragments. He'd fall like all the others had fallen, and Rhett's reputation would be cemented even stronger. The man who killed the farmer who didn't fear him. But Elias Varn didn't stop walking. 8 feet, 6 feet, close enough now that Rhett could see the individual lines etched into his weathered face, could see the absolute certainty in those pale gray eyes. "Shoot me," Elias said softly, now just 4 feet away, so close that Rhett could smell the dust and sweat and earth on him. "Or don't, but make a choice, boy. Stop pretending this is about me disrespecting you. This is about you not understanding what real strength looks like." The gun was shaking now, Rhett's entire arm trembling with the effort of holding it steady. His finger was on the trigger, had been on the trigger, but somehow the shot wouldn't come. Couldn't come. Because Jenny had been right, because this whole town was watching, because pulling this trigger would prove. Elias reached out with his left hand, slowly, giving Rhett every opportunity to react, and wrapped his fingers around the gun barrel. "You want to know what scared me?" the old man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I was young and stupid like you, what kept me awake at night? What made my hands shake?" Rhett couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare into those eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine. "Nothing," Elias continued. "Nothing scared me because I thought I was already dead inside. Thought feeling nothing made me strong. You know what I learned?" The old man's grip on the gun barrel tightened slightly. "Being willing to die is easy. Living with yourself, that's the hard part." Then he moved. It happened so fast that Rhett's mind couldn't track the motion until it was over. One moment they were standing face to face, Rhett holding a gun that Elias was gripping by the barrel. The next moment, the old man had pivoted, used the walking staff as a fulcrum, and executed a technique so precise and economical that it seemed like Rhett simply chose to let go of his weapon. The Colt spun through the air and landed in the dust 15 feet away. Rhett stumbled backward, his hand empty, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs that built into exclamations. Rhett Callahan, the fastest draw in 3 territories, the man who'd never been beaten, had been disarmed by an old farmer with a wooden stick. He stared at his empty hand, then at the gun lying in the dirt, then at Elias, who simply stood there with his staff looking vaguely disappointed. "That's the problem with relying on one thing," the old man said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Take it away, and what's left?" Rhett's world tilted on its axis. Everything he'd built, every reputation, every fear, every carefully constructed identity, felt like sand running through his fingers. The crowd was staring at him with expressions he'd never seen directed his way before: pity, curiosity, and worst of all, the beginning of something that might have been contempt. He could feel his legend crumbling in real time. "You—" His voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "You'll regret that." "Maybe." Elias turned and began walking away, staff tapping against the ground with each step. "But I doubt it." "I'll kill you," Rhett screamed at the retreating figure. "You hear me, old man? I'll hunt you down. I'll burn your farm. I'll make you suffer in ways you can't imagine." Elias didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the threats, just kept walking at that same measured pace until he disappeared into the gathering darkness. The crowd began to disperse, their voices low and excited, already transforming what they'd witnessed into the stories they'd tell. Rhett stood alone in the center of the street, his gun still lying in the dirt where it had fallen, his reputation bleeding out into the dust like a gut-shot man. Jenny approached from the edge of the crowd. She picked up the Colt, brushed it off, and held it out to him. "You should go," she said gently. "Tonight, before this gets worse." He snatched the gun from her hand with more force than necessary and shoved it back into his holster. "This ain't over. Not even close." "I know." Her eyes were sad. "That's what worries me." She left him there, standing in the empty street under a sky full of indifferent stars. Rhett's hands clenched into fists, his breathing ragged, with a mixture of humiliation and rage and something else he refused to name. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow he'd gather men. Tomorrow, he'd ride out to that farm and show Elias Varn what happened to people who made him look weak. Tomorrow he'd reclaim everything he'd lost tonight. Tomorrow. But as he stood there in the darkness, gun heavy on his hip and heart heavier in his chest, Rhett Callahan felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt small, and somewhere in the night, walking steadily toward a small farm on the outskirts of nowhere, an old man who'd stopped being afraid of death a long time ago allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The dance had begun. Rhett didn't leave Red Hollow that night. He couldn't. Leaving would have been an admission that Elias Varn had beaten him, and the moment he admitted that, even to himself, everything he'd built would collapse completely. Instead, he returned to the saloon and drank until the world blurred at the edges, until the faces of the patrons who'd witnessed his humiliation became indistinct shadows, until he could almost convince himself that tomorrow would be different. But dawn arrived with the cruel clarity of sobriety, and with it came the whispers. He heard them from his room above the saloon, voices drifting up through the floorboards like smoke. The early risers, the men who gathered for coffee before the day's work began, they were talking. About him. About last night. About how the great Rhett Callahan had been disarmed by an old farmer with a stick. Didn't even see it happen. It was so fast. You think maybe the old man used to be somebody? Before? Don't matter who he was, matters who Rhett ain't anymore. That last comment, spoken by a voice Rhett didn't recognize, hit him like a physical blow. He rolled out of bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and stared at himself in the cracked mirror above the wash basin. The face that looked back was haggard, eyes bloodshot and ringed with dark circles. This wasn't the face of legend. This was the face of a man coming apart. He splashed water on his face, changed his shirt, and strapped on his gun belt with hands that only shook a little. Then he descended the stairs into the saloon's main room. The conversation stopped the moment his boots hit the floor. Every head turned toward him, and in their eyes he saw something that made his stomach turn. Curiosity instead of fear. They were watching him the way you'd watch a wounded animal, wondering what it would do next, whether it still had teeth. "Morning, Mr. Callahan," the bartender said carefully, setting out a cup of coffee without being asked. "Sleep well?" The question was innocent enough, but Rhett heard the subtext. Everyone in this room knew he hadn't slept, knew he'd drunk himself into a stupor trying to forget what had happened in the street. "Where can I find Jack Reeves?" Rhett's voice came out rougher than he intended. The bartender's eyes widened slightly. Jack Reeves was Red Hollow's closest thing to a lawman, a former bounty hunter who'd settled into the role of keeping the peace through a combination of reputation and pragmatism. He and Rhett had maintained a careful distance since Rhett rode into town, each recognizing in the other someone dangerous enough to make conflict costly. Probably at his office, down the street, next to the telegraph station. Rhett nodded and walked out without touching the coffee. Behind him, the whispers resumed immediately, speculation building on speculation. Let them talk, he thought. By tonight, they'd have something real to whisper about. The morning sun was already hot, promising a scorching afternoon. Red Hollow looked different in daylight, smaller, more shabby than threatening. Or maybe it was just that Rhett was seeing it through different eyes now. Eyes that had watched his invincibility shatter like dropped glass. Jack Reeves was exactly where the bartender said he'd be, sitting behind a scarred desk in a small office that smelled of tobacco and old paper. He was a big man, barrel-chested and thick-armed, with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes tracked Rhett from the moment he appeared in the doorway. "Callahan," Reeves said neutrally. He didn't stand, didn't offer his hand. "What can I do for you?" "I need men. 4 or 5. The kind who know how to handle themselves in a fight." Reeves leaned back in his chair, making it creak. "That's so. What kind of fight are we talking about?" "The kind where an old man needs to learn respect." Rhett pulled out a leather pouch and dropped it on the desk. Coins clinked heavily inside. $50 per man. 1 day's work. Interested? For a long moment, Reeves just stared at the money. Then he pushed it back across the desk with one thick finger. No. Rhett's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. That wasn't a request. And this ain't a negotiation. Reeves stood slowly, his considerable bulk making the movement deliberate and threatening. You want to ride out to Elias Varn's farm and do whatever it is you're planning to do, that's your business. But you ain't dragging this town into it. You ain't using men from Red Hollow to settle a score that's yours alone. You saw what he did to me last night. You saw him make me look weak in front of everyone. I saw him defend himself when you drew on him. Reeves came around the desk, stopping just outside of arm's reach. I saw you threaten an unarmed man and get disarmed for your trouble. That ain't the same as being attacked, Callahan. That's consequences. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Rhett's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. People in this town respect you because they think you're smart. Refusing me ain't smart. It's suicidal. Reeves smiled, and it wasn't a friendly expression. See, that's where you're wrong. I respect Elias Varn. Known him for 20 years, and in all that time, he's never started trouble with anyone. Never raised his voice, never threw a punch, never gave me a moment's worry. Then you roll into town like you own it and decide to humiliate him for no reason except you were bored. He took a step closer. So no, I won't help you. And if you're smart, which I'm starting to doubt, you'll leave that old man alone and ride out of Red Hollow before this gets worse. Rhett's hand was on his gun now, palm resting on the grip. Worse for who? For you. Reeves's voice dropped to a growl. Because if you push this, If you hurt that man, there's going to be consequences you ain't prepared for. And this time, it won't be just a wooden stick taking your gun away. They stood there, two dangerous men on the edge of violence, the morning sunlight streaming through the window making dust motes dance between them. Rhett could feel his heartbeat in his throat, could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline that always preceded killing. He could draw right now, put a bullet through Jack Reeves's skull, watch him drop like a sack of grain. But then what? Fight the whole town? Prove to everyone watching that he was exactly what Elias had called him, a man who mattered only because people were afraid? He took his hand off his gun. "You'll regret this," he said, backing toward the door. "Maybe," Reeves replied, "but I'll regret it alive." Rhett stepped out into the street and walked without direction or purpose, his mind racing. If he couldn't get help in Red Hollow, he'd find it elsewhere. There were always men willing to work for money, men with no loyalty to small-town lawmen or old farmers. He just needed to know where to look. He found himself at the livery stable where his horse, a black gelding named Prophet, was being tended by a boy of maybe 14. The kid looked up as Rhett approached, and there it was again, curiosity instead of fear. "Your horse is fed and watered, sir," the boy said, keeping a careful distance. "You heading out?" "Maybe. You know where I might find men looking for work? The kind who ain't particular about what that work involves?" The boy hesitated, clearly weighing the danger of answering against the danger of refusing. Finally, he said, "There's a camp about 10 miles north, prospectors mostly, but some rougher types too. Men who didn't find gold and are looking for other ways to make money." Rhett flipped him a coin. "Much obliged." He saddled Prophet himself, ignoring the boy's offer of help, and rode out of Red Hollow heading north. The whispers would continue in his absence, but that couldn't be helped now. What mattered was finding the right men and returning with enough force to make Elias Varn understand that last night had been mercy, and mercy had limits. The ride took just under 2 hours. The camp, when he found it, was exactly what he'd expected, a collection of ragged tents and lean-tos clustered around a played-out creek bed. Men sat in clusters, some panning for gold that wasn't there anymore, others just drinking away the disappointment of dreams gone sour. Rhett dismounted near the largest tent and let his presence announce itself. It didn't take long. Men like these recognized predators on sight, and Rhett had worked hard to perfect that image. A man emerged from the tent, middle-aged, with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, and the look of someone who'd survived things that should have killed him. He studied Rhett with the practiced eye of someone who'd sized up trouble before. "You're a long way from anywhere," the man said. "What brings you to our humble establishment?" "Business proposition. I need 4 men who can handle themselves in a fight. 1 day's work, $50 each, no questions asked." The scarred man's eyebrows rose. $50 is a lot of money for 1 day. Must be dangerous work. "Nothing you can't handle if you're worth your salt." Rhett pulled out his money pouch and let it jingle significantly. "I just need to know if you're interested." "Depends. What's the work?" "Convincing an old man to apologize." The scarred man laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. "You need 4 armed men to make an old man apologize? Must be some old man." "He is." Rhett met his eyes directly. "But the money's real, and the work's simple. You in or not?" The man studied him for a long moment, then turned and called out 3 names. Men emerged from various tents, all of them hard-looking, all of them carrying weapons that had seen use. They gathered around, and the scarred man explained the offer. $50 to rough up an old man?" one of them said, a lanky fellow with missing teeth. "Hell, I'd do it for 20. Then you're getting a bargain," Rhett said. "We ride out this afternoon. The farm's about 5 miles east of Red Hollow. We go in, we make him understand his mistake, we leave. Simple." "What's his mistake?" asked another man, this one shorter and stockier with hands like hammers. "He disrespected me." The 4 men exchanged glances. Then the scarred man shrugged. "Your money, your business? We'll ride at sundown. That old man's going to wish he'd kept his mouth shut." But as they discussed logistics and prepared their gear, Rhett found his mind wandering back to those pale gray eyes, to the absolute certainty in Elias Varn's voice when he'd said, "Being willing to die is easy. Living with yourself, that's the hard part." What had the old man meant by that? What did he know that Rhett didn't? These questions gnawed at him through the afternoon as the sun crawled across the sky. By the time they were mounted and ready to ride, Rhett had pushed them aside and replaced them with cold fury. It didn't matter what Elias knew. It didn't matter what he'd been or what he thought he understood about life. All that mattered was restoring the natural order, the order where Rhett Callahan was feared, and men who crossed him paid the price. They rode toward Red Hollow as the sun began its descent, 5 men on horseback moving like a small army. People saw them coming and moved quickly out of the way. Word would spread fast. Rhett Callahan was back with reinforcements. He led them straight through town without stopping, ignoring the stares and whispers. Jack Reeves stood in his doorway, face dark with anger, but he made no move to intervene. What could he do against 5 armed men? Start a war in the middle of his town? They rode east, following the road that Elias had walked just yesterday. The land opened up into farmland, fields of corn and wheat stretching toward distant tree lines. And there, sitting modest and plain under the fading light, was a small farmhouse with a barn behind it. Smoke rose from the chimney, a lamp burned in one window. Someone was home. Rhett raised a hand, stopping the group about 100 yards out. His heart was pounding again, but this time it felt different. This time he had force on his side. This time there would be no humiliation, no disarmament, no gentle lectures about strength and weakness. This time he would win. "Remember," he said to the 4 men flanking him, "we're just teaching a lesson. Rough him up if he resists, but I want him alive and conscious to apologize." "And if he don't resist?" the scarred man asked. "Then it'll be quick." They spurred their horses forward, closing the distance in seconds. Rhett dismounted first, his hand on his gun, and approached the front door. The others fanned out, surrounding the house to cut off any escape routes. He knocked. 3 hard raps that echoed in the evening stillness. For a moment, nothing. Then footsteps, slow and measured, approaching from inside. The door opened, and there stood Elias Varn holding a cup of coffee and looking mildly surprised to have visitors. "Mr. Callahan," he said calmly, "didn't expect to see you again so soon. Come out here, old man. We need to finish our conversation." Elias glanced past Rhett at the 4 armed men positioned around his property. "Brought friends, I see. Must have been lonely." "I ain't here to joke. You embarrassed me in front of the whole town. Now you're going to apologize, and you're going to mean it." "Or what? You'll shoot me?" Elias took a sip of his coffee. "Thought we already established that ain't as easy as you think." Rhett drew his gun, this time keeping it at his side rather than pointing it directly. "There's 5 of us and 1 of you. You ain't disarming all of us with a wooden stick." "Probably not," Elias agreed. He set down his coffee cup on a small table just inside the door. "Though I'd likely get 2 or 3 of you before you put me down. Question is, which 3 want to die for $50? The 4 hired men shifted uncomfortably. They'd been expecting an easy job. Terrorizing an old farmer should have been simple. But something about the way Elias spoke, the complete absence of fear in his voice, made them reconsider the odds. "Nobody has to die," Rhett said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just apologize. Admit you were wrong to disrespect me. Do that, and we ride away." Elias stepped fully out onto the porch, and for the first time Rhett noticed what he was holding. Not the walking staff from yesterday, but something else. A simple length of rope, coiled loosely in his left hand. "You really don't understand, do you?" the old man said softly. "This ain't about respect. This ain't about you at all. You're here because you need me to validate that the person you've made yourself into is worth something. You need me to be afraid so you can feel strong." "Shut up." Rhett raised the gun, pointing it directly at Elias's chest. "Just shut up and apologize." I can't give you what you need, boy. Nobody can, because what you need ain't an apology. It's permission to stop being what you've become. And that permission can only come from you." "I said shut up!" The scarred man spoke up from his position near the barn. "Callahan, maybe we should—" Elias moved. The rope in his hand suddenly wasn't just a rope, it was a weapon, snapping out with impossible speed and wrapping around Rhett's gun hand. Before he could pull the trigger, the old man yanked hard, and Rhett stumbled forward. The gun discharged into the ground, dirt exploding upward. Then everything happened at once. The 4 hired men drew their weapons, but Elias was already moving, using Rhett's own momentum against him, spinning him around as a shield between himself and the guns. Rhett felt the rope cinch tight around his wrist, felt himself being manipulated like a puppet by hands that knew exactly where to apply pressure. "Don't shoot!" he screamed at his hired men. "Don't!" Elias released him suddenly, and Rhett sprawled forward onto his hands and knees. He looked up just in time to see the old man standing alone in the center of the yard, the rope coiled again in his hand, facing 4 armed men without apparent concern. "You boys got a choice," Elias said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "You can try to earn your money and see where that leads, or you can ride out of here and find work that won't get you killed. Think carefully." The lanky man with missing teeth spoke up, his gun wavering slightly. "We got numbers on you, old man. 4 against 1. 5 against 1, Rhett corrected, climbing to his feet and retrieving his gun. His wrist ached where the rope had bitten into it, and his pride hurt worse. "And this time I ain't giving him chances." But even as he said it, doubt crept into his voice. Twice now he'd come at Elias with deadly intent, and twice he'd ended up disarmed or humiliated. What made him think the third time would be different? "I used to train men like you," Elias said, and there was something new in his voice now, not anger, but a deep sadness that somehow felt worse. Young, angry boys who thought strength meant being the scariest thing in the room. You know what happened to most of them? He took a step forward, and all 5 guns tracked his movement. They died young, died stupid, died thinking they mattered because people were afraid of them, right up until they met someone faster or smarter or just plain luckier. Is that what you want, Mr. Callahan? To die out here in the dirt fighting over nothing? "This ain't nothing." Rhett's voice cracked with emotion he couldn't name. "You made me look weak." "I made you look human," Elias corrected gently. "And that terrifies you, don't it? Because if you're human, then all those people you hurt, all those lives you took, they mean something. They matter. And you can't hide from that behind a reputation anymore." The words cut deeper than any blade. Rhett felt something breaking inside him, some wall he'd built years ago starting to crumble. He raised his gun with both hands, trying to stop the shaking. "I'll kill you," he whispered. "I swear I'll—" "Then do it." Elias spread his arms wide, dropping the rope. "Shoot me. Prove to these men and to yourself that you're still Rhett Callahan, still the monster everyone fears. Pull that trigger and go back to Red Hollow with my blood on your hands." Silence fell across the farmyard, broken only by the evening wind rustling through corn stalks and the nervous breathing of 5 men with guns drawn. Rhett's finger tightened on the trigger, applying pressure, feeling the resistance of the mechanism. 1 more pound of pressure, maybe less, but Elias's words echoed in his head. "Being willing to die is easy. Living with yourself, that's the hard part." And suddenly, Rhett understood what the old man had been trying to tell him, what Jenny had tried to tell him, what some small voice inside himself had been screaming for years. Killing Elias wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't restore his reputation, wouldn't fill the emptiness inside him, wouldn't make him feel less like a hollow shell of violence and fear pretending to be a human being. It would just be 1 more body, 1 more death, 1 more brick in the wall separating him from anything resembling peace. His hand lowered, the gun dropping to his side. "I can't," he heard himself say, the words distant and strange in his own ears. The 4 hired men looked at each other in confusion. The scarred man spoke up. "Callahan, what the hell are you—" "Just go," Rhett interrupted. "Take your money and go, all of you." "But the job—" "There is no job." The shout tore out of him, raw and ragged. "Just take the damn money and leave." For a moment, the 4 men seemed poised between greed and self-preservation. Then, one by one, they holstered their weapons and mounted their horses. The scarred man rode close to Rhett as he passed. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "Walking away from this?" "Yeah," Rhett replied. "Probably." He watched them ride off into the gathering darkness, taking with them the last shred of the person he'd been when he rode into Red Hollow 4 days ago. When their hoofbeats had faded completely, he turned back to Elias, who stood watching him with those winter sky eyes. "What now?" Rhett asked, genuinely not knowing the answer. Elias bent down and picked up the rope, coiling it with practiced movements. "Now you decide what kind of man you want to be. The kind who rides away and keeps on being what you've been, or the kind who stays and learns there's more to strength than fear." "I don't understand." "I know. That's why you need to stay." The old man walked toward his porch, then paused and looked back. There's a cot in the barn, and I got beans on the stove. You're welcome to both if you want them." He disappeared into the house, leaving Rhett standing alone in the yard with his gun hanging uselessly in his hand and his entire worldview shattered into pieces around his feet. Rhett Callahan, the most feared gunslinger in 3 territories, the man who'd built an empire on terror and death, felt tears running down his face and didn't know why. But somewhere deep inside, in a place he'd thought dead for years, something small and fragile began to stir. Something that might have been hope, or might have been the first trembling steps toward becoming someone different, someone better, or maybe just someone human. He holstered his gun and walked slowly toward the barn, each step feeling like both an ending and a beginning, knowing that tomorrow would bring questions he couldn't answer and challenges he couldn't imagine. But for tonight, beans and a cot in a stranger's barn felt like more than he deserved, and somehow exactly what he needed. The barn smelled of hay and leather and something else Rhett couldn't quite name. Maybe peace, though he'd never been close enough to it before to recognize the scent. He stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the simple cot Elias had mentioned, a thin blanket folded neatly at its foot. Prophet nickered softly from a stall, already fed and watered by hands Rhett hadn't seen work. He didn't deserve this kindness, didn't deserve the beans cooking in the house, or the shelter from the cooling night air. He'd come here twice with murder in his heart, had brought armed men to terrorize an old farmer whose only crime was refusing to be afraid. By any measure of justice, he should be bleeding out in the dirt right now, not standing in a warm barn wondering what the hell happened to his life. The sound of footsteps made him turn. Elias appeared in the doorway carrying 2 bowls, steam rising from both. He handed one to Rhett without a word and settled himself on a hay bale, eating slowly and methodically. Rhett looked down at the bowl, simple beans with bits of salt pork, a chunk of cornbread balanced on the rim. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday. He sat on the cot and took a bite. It was the best thing he'd ever tasted, though he suspected that had more to do with his emotional state than the cooking. They ate in silence for several minutes before Rhett finally spoke. "Why didn't you kill me?" Elias chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Didn't need to. I came here to kill you, twice. I know. Most men would have defended themselves, would have had every right to put me down. Most men ain't me." Elias set his empty bowl aside and looked at Rhett with those pale gray eyes that seemed to see everything. "Killing you would have been easy, would have been justified even, but it wouldn't have taught you nothing, and teaching is more important than killing." "Teaching what?" "That you got a choice." The old man stood and walked to Prophet's stall, running a hand along the horse's neck with casual affection. "Every moment of every day, you got a choice about who you are and what you do. You've been making the same choice for so long you forgot it was a choice at all, thought it was just who you are." Rhett set down his bowl, suddenly not hungry anymore. "You don't know anything about me. I know everything about you." Elias's voice was gentle but firm. "Because I was you. Different name, different territory, different reasons maybe, but the same angry boy pretending to be a man, using violence to fill a hole inside that violence can't ever fill. That's not, don't lie to me, and don't lie to yourself. Not here, not now." Elias turned to face him fully. "You want to know why you really came back here after I disarmed you? It wasn't about revenge or reputation. It was because some part of you recognized something in me, recognized a way out of the trap you built for yourself." The words hit too close to truth for Rhett to deflect. He felt his throat tighten, felt that shameful moisture building in his eyes again. "I don't know how to be anything else," he admitted quietly. "I know, that's why you're still here instead of riding away." Elias moved to the barn door and looked out at the darkening sky. "Tomorrow morning, you got another choice to make. You can mount that horse and ride back to being Rhett Callahan, gunslinger and killer. Nobody's stopping you. Or you can stay here and learn there's more than one way to be strong." "Stay here? And do what?" "Work. Learn. Figure out who you are when you ain't got a gun defining you." He glanced back at Rhett. "Fair warning, though, it ain't gonna be easy. Might be the hardest thing you ever done. And there ain't no glory in it, no reputation, no fear, just the work itself and what it makes you into." Rhett lay back on the cot, staring up at the barn rafters where swallows nested in the shadows. Everything in him screamed to refuse, to ride out tonight and never look back. He was Rhett Callahan. He didn't bow down to anyone, didn't learn from farmers, didn't humble himself for the sake of some vague promise of becoming better. But that small thing that had stirred inside him earlier, that fragile possibility, whispered a different message. It whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was a version of himself that could sleep without nightmares, that could look in a mirror without seeing a monster, that could exist in the world without leaving a trail of bodies and broken spirits. "If I stay," he said slowly, "what happens to who I was?" "He dies," Elias replied simply. "That's the price. You can't become something new while clinging to what you were. That boy who rode into Red Hollow looking for someone to hurt, he's got to die so someone else can live." "I don't know if I can do that." "Only one way to find out." Elias walked toward the barn door, then paused. "Get some sleep. Morning comes early on a farm, and if you're here when it does, we got a lot of work ahead of us." He disappeared into the night, leaving Rhett alone with his thoughts and the gentle sounds of Prophet settling into sleep. The cot was surprisingly comfortable, the blanket worn soft with age and use. Rhett closed his eyes and waited for sleep that he was certain wouldn't come. But exhaustion, both physical and emotional, had other plans. Within minutes, he drifted off into a deep, dreamless sleep that felt like a small mercy he didn't deserve. When he woke, gray light was filtering through the barn's gaps and cracks. For a disoriented moment, he didn't know where he was. Then it all came rushing back. The confrontation, the hired men, the choice that had led him to this cot in this barn. He sat up, every muscle in his body protesting. His mouth tasted like old copper, and his head ached with the ghost of yesterday's whiskey. Through the barn door, he could see the farmhouse. Smoke rose from the chimney. Elias was already awake. Rhett's gun belt lay coiled beside the cot where he'd left it. He stared at it for a long time, then stood and walked outside without picking it up. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of dew-damp earth and growing things. Elias was in the yard, carrying 2 wooden buckets toward the well. He saw Rhett and nodded in greeting. "Morning. There's coffee in the pot if you want it. After that, we'll start with the fence line on the south pasture. Needs mending before the cattle push through it." No preamble, no asking if Rhett had decided to stay. Just an assumption that work needed doing and 2 men were available to do it. Rhett found the coffee pot on the stove in the small farmhouse kitchen. The house was spare but clean, everything in its place with the kind of order that spoke to decades of living alone. He poured himself a cup and drank it black, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. When he emerged, Elias was loading tools into a wagon, hammers, rolls of wire, wooden fence posts. He gestured for Rhett to climb aboard, and they set off across the property as the sun crept above the horizon. The fence line ran for what looked like miles, separating Elias's land from open range. About a quarter-mile out, Rhett could see where several posts had rotted through and the wire sagged dangerously low. "Ever mend a fence before?" Elias asked as they climbed down from the wagon. "No." "Then you're about to learn." The old man handed him a shovel. "First thing you need to understand about fences is they're like discipline. Only work if you maintain them constant. Let them go too long and the whole thing falls apart." Rhett took the shovel, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It was heavier than his gun, more awkward. He'd spent years perfecting the draw, training his hands to move with lethal precision. Now those same hands struggled to grip a simple farming tool correctly. "You're holding it wrong," Elias said, not unkindly. "Here, like this." He demonstrated the proper grip, the angle of the blade, the way to use your whole body instead of just your arms. "Now dig out around that rotted post. We need to pull it and put in a new one." For the next hour, Rhett dug. The soil was harder than it looked, packed tight with clay and stones. His hands, which had never blistered from holding a gun, began to blister from the shovel handle. His back ached. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cool morning air. And through it all, Elias worked beside him with that same patient efficiency, demonstrating techniques, offering corrections, never rushing or criticizing, just teaching. "Why are you doing this?" Rhett finally asked, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead. "Teaching me, I mean, after everything I did?" Elias pulled a rotted post from the ground and set it aside. "Because someone did it for me once. Long time ago, when I was young and stupid and convinced that strength meant being the scariest thing in any room. What happened? What changed you? The old man was quiet for a moment, staring out across the pasture at nothing in particular. I met someone who showed me a different way. A man named Samuel Cross. He was old even then, must have been 70 if he was a day. I tried to rob him. Rhett stopped digging. What did he do? Invited me to stay for supper. A smile ghosted across Elias's weathered face. Can you imagine? This angry kid with a gun pointed at his head, and he asks if I like venison stew. Said he'd made too much and could use the company. You could have killed him. Could have. Probably should have, given who I was then. But something about the way he looked at me, not afraid, not angry, just patient, like he could see past the mask I'd built and knew there was something worth saving underneath. Elias picked up a new post and positioned it in the hole Rhett had dug. So I stayed. One night turned into a week. Week turned into months. And slowly, piece by piece, he taught me that being strong didn't mean being feared. It meant being in control of yourself, not needing to control others. Where is he now? Dead 10 years, left me this farm and everything he knew. Elias began packing soil around the new post, tamping it down firmly. Before he died, he made me promise something. Made me promise that if I ever met someone like I'd been, someone angry and lost and convinced that violence was the only answer, I'd try to do for them what he did for me. The implication hung in the air between them. Rhett felt something catch in his throat. I ain't worth saving, he said quietly. That's what I told Samuel. You know what he said? Elias looked up, those pale eyes intense. He said, nobody's worth saving until they decide to be saved. But everybody deserves the chance to make that decision. They worked in silence after that, pulling rotted posts and setting new ones, stringing wire and testing its tension. The sun climbed higher, turning the morning cool into midday heat. Rhett's hands bled where blisters had popped. His shoulders screamed. Every muscle in his body felt like it was on fire. But there was something meditative about the work, something that quieted the constant noise in his head. The simple repetition of dig, lift, set, pack. No thinking required. No calculations about who might be a threat or who needed to be put in their place. Just the work itself and the slow, satisfying progress of a fence line being restored. By the time they finished, the sun was past its zenith and starting its descent. Elias surveyed their work with a satisfied nod. Good. That'll hold through winter at least. He loaded the tools back into the wagon. You did well for your first day. Doesn't feel like much, Rhett said, looking at the fence that had consumed an entire day's labor. It never does. That's the thing about real work. It don't announce itself. Don't make you feel important or powerful. Just gets done, quiet and necessary, and the world's a little better for it. Elias climbed onto the wagon seat. Come on, let's get some food in you before you fall over. Back at the farmhouse, Elias prepared a simple meal of fried eggs and potatoes while Rhett washed the worst of the dirt from his hands and face. They ate on the porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow we'll work on the north field, Elias said between bites. Needs plowing before we can plant. After that, the roof's got some shingles need replacing. Then there's the well that could use cleaning out, and the barn door's been sticking something fierce. It was a litany of endless labor, of work that never truly finished because a farm was a living thing that required constant attention. The old Rhett would have been horrified at the prospect, but something in him now found it almost comforting, the idea of days with clear purposes, of problems that could be solved with effort and time. Can I ask you something? Rhett said as darkness settled around them. Go ahead. That first day, in town, when I tried to humiliate you, you could have walked away, could have ignored me. Why didn't you? Elias was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable in the gathering shadows. Because I recognized you, saw the same desperation I'd carried for years. And I thought, maybe if I didn't give you the reaction you wanted, didn't feed the need that was eating you alive, maybe you'd start to question what you'd become. You couldn't have known I'd come back. No, but I hoped. Samuel taught me that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a dangerous man is refuse to be afraid of him, takes away his power, forces him to confront what's really driving him. He stood and collected their plates. You could have gone in a lot of different directions after that first day. You chose to come back. That tells me something. What? That you want to change. Might not know how, might be scared to death of what that means, but the wanting is there, and that's where it starts. Rhett helped wash the dishes in a basin of warm water, another simple task that felt strangely significant. When they finished, Elias handed him a lantern. Go get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be harder than today. In the barn, Rhett lay on the cot and stared at the rafters again. His gun belt still sat where he'd left it this morning, untouched. He reached for it, felt the familiar weight of the Colt, the smooth wood of the grips. For a moment he was tempted to strap it on, to feel like himself again. But the person he'd been didn't live here, couldn't exist in a world of fence mending and plowing and patient lessons about strength that didn't come from fear. That person belonged to saloons and dusty streets, and the moment before the draw, when everything hung in perfect, terrible balance. He set the gun belt aside and pulled the blanket over himself, closing his eyes against the flood of questions that threatened to overwhelm him. Who was he without the gun? Without the reputation? Without the fear? He didn't have answers yet, but for the first time in years he wanted to find them. The next morning came even earlier. Elias woke him before dawn, and they ate a quick breakfast of oatmeal and black coffee before heading to the north field. The plow was old but well-maintained, pulled by 2 draft horses that Elias handled with easy competence. Ever worked with horses? The old man asked. Just rode them. Not the same thing. Riding is about control. Working with them is about partnership. He handed Rhett the reins. They need to trust you, and you need to trust them. No force, no fear. Just clear communication and mutual respect. Rhett took the reins, feeling the weight of the horse's attention on him. They were massive animals, each one capable of killing him with a single kick. But Elias had said no fear, so he pushed down the instinctive wariness and tried to project calm confidence instead. The horses shuffled nervously but didn't bolt. Progress. For the next several hours, Elias taught him the basics of plowing, how to keep the furrows straight, how to read the soil's texture, how to work with the horse's rhythm instead of against it. It was brutally hard work, requiring constant attention and physical effort that made fence mending look easy by comparison. Rhett's shoulders burned, his legs trembled. The blisters on his hands from yesterday reopened and bled, then calloused over through sheer necessity. But he kept going, following Elias's patient instructions, learning to feel when the plow hit a stone, learning to guide the horses with gentle pressure instead of yanking the reins. They worked through the heat of midday, pausing only for water and a brief rest in the shade of a lone oak tree at the field's edge. Rhett collapsed against the trunk, gasping. "How do you do this every day?" he asked when he could breathe again. Practice. And understanding that strength ain't about one big moment of glory. It's about showing up every day and doing what needs doing, whether you feel like it or not. Elias passed him a canteen. The work I'm teaching you ain't just about farming. It's about discipline, about controlling yourself instead of trying to control everyone else. I don't feel in control. I feel like I'm dying. Good. That means you're doing it right. The old man smiled slightly. The person you were, the gunslinger, the killer, he's dying. Got to die so someone new can be born. And birth is painful, whether it's bringing new life into the world or bringing new life to yourself. They worked until the sun touched the horizon, completing maybe a third of the field. Exhausted and aching, they returned to the farmhouse for another simple meal. Rhett's hand shook so badly he could barely hold his fork. Tomorrow, we'll finish the plowing, Elias said. Day after that, we plant. Then there's the roof and the well and about 100 other things that need attention before winter. Winter's months away, which is exactly why we start now. Preparation is how you survive, not just in farming, but in life. He studied Rhett across the table. You're doing better than I expected, you know. Most men with your history would have given up by now. I've thought about it, Rhett admitted, every hour of every day. But you haven't. That matters. Elias stood and stretched, his joints popping audibly. Get some sleep. Your body needs to recover. In the barn that night, Rhett examined his ruined hands by lantern light. They were covered in blisters and calluses, dirt ground into every crease despite washing. These weren't the hands of a gunslinger anymore. These were becoming the hands of someone who worked for a living. He picked up his gun belt and held it, feeling its weight. The Colt was still clean and oiled, still ready to kill at a moment's notice, but when he tried to do a practice draw, his hands were so sore and stiff that he fumbled it completely. The gun clattered to the barn floor. A week ago, that would have terrified him. His speed was his life, his identity, his entire reason for existing. Losing it would have been like losing a limb. But now, staring at the gun lying in the hay, he felt only a strange sense of relief. Maybe he didn't need to be the fastest anymore. Maybe there were other ways to be strong. He left the gun where it fell and went to sleep. Days blurred into weeks. Rhett's body slowly adapted to the relentless physical labor, building muscle in places he'd never used before, developing endurance that had nothing to do with how long he could stand in a gunfight. His hands became leather tough. His back stopped screaming quite so loudly. And through it all, Elias taught him, not just farming, but the philosophy behind it. How to read the land and work with it instead of against it. How to plan ahead, thinking in seasons instead of moments. How to find satisfaction in work well done, even when no one was watching to acknowledge it. They spoke rarely during the work itself, but in the evenings, sitting on the porch as the sun set, Elias would share stories from his past. Not the violent parts. Those he mentioned only in passing, brief acknowledgments that, yes, he'd done terrible things and carried their weight still. But the other parts, the lessons learned, the slow, painful process of becoming someone different. "You ever regret it?" Rhett asked one evening. "Giving up who you were?" "Every damn day," Elias replied honestly. "The man I was had purpose, had direction, didn't have to think or question or wonder if he was doing the right thing, just acted, consequences be damned." "Then why?" "Because that man was dying inside. Oh, he didn't know it. Thought he was alive, thought he was living. But he was just existing, consuming and destroying and leaving nothing behind but pain and emptiness." The old man stared out at his fields, at the work of decades. "This life, this quiet life, it ain't easy, ain't exciting, but it's real. It means something. And when I die, I'll leave behind more than just fear and bodies. I'll leave behind growing things." Rhett thought about that as he lay in the barn that night. What would he leave behind when he died? What mark would Rhett Callahan make on the world beyond the scars he'd inflicted? The question haunted him through the following days as they finished planting the north field, as they repaired the roof under a merciless sun, as they cleaned out the well and discovered it was deeper and colder than expected. The work was endless, yes, but it was also purposeful in a way he'd never experienced. Everything he'd done before had been about him. His reputation, his fear, his need to feel powerful. But this work wasn't about him at all. It was about the crops that would feed someone next year, the fence that would keep cattle safe, the roof that would shelter against winter storms yet to come. 3 weeks after Rhett had arrived at the farm, as they worked together replacing rotted boards in the barn wall, Elias suddenly stopped and looked toward the road. His expression tightened. "Riders coming," he said quietly. 4 of them. Rhett turned and felt his stomach drop. He recognized them even at a distance. The 4 hired men he'd brought here weeks ago. They'd returned, and they weren't alone. A 5th rider accompanied them, someone Rhett didn't recognize but whose posture screamed danger even from hundreds of yards away. "Get in the house," Elias said, his voice calm but firm. "Now." "No." Rhett's hand moved instinctively to his hip, but his gun wasn't there. Hadn't been there for days now. "They're here because of me. You should trust me." Elias's pale eyes locked onto his. "Go inside. Stay there. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you stay inside until I come get you. Understand?" Every instinct Rhett had developed over years of violence screamed at him to fight, to face the threat, to prove he wasn't hiding like a coward. But something else, something new and fragile, whispered that maybe trusting someone else's judgment was its own kind of strength. He ran for the house as the riders drew closer, their horses kicking up dust in the fading afternoon light. From the window, he watched Elias walk calmly into the center of the yard and wait, staff in hand, for whatever came next. And Rhett realized with sudden, terrible clarity that the old man had known this was coming, had been preparing for it, and that everything he'd taught Rhett over the past weeks might have been leading to exactly this moment. From the window, Rhett watched the 5 riders fan out as they entered the yard, their formation deliberate and tactical. The scarred man he recognized from before sat on the left, his hand resting casually on his holster. The other 3 hired men positioned themselves at angles that provided crossfire coverage. But it was the 5th rider who commanded attention, a tall man dressed entirely in black, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, sitting his horse with the stillness of a coiled snake. Elias stood in the center of the yard, staff planted in the dirt, waiting with that same infinite patience Rhett had come to recognize over the past weeks. He looked small against the 5 mounted men, fragile even, but there was something in his posture that suggested he'd stood in places like this before, faced odds like this before, and survived. The man in black spoke first, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. "Elias Varn. Been a long time." "Not long enough, Marcus." Elias's tone was neutral, but Rhett caught the tension underneath. "What brings you to my farm?" "Unfinished business." The man called Marcus dismounted with fluid grace, and Rhett finally got a clear look at his face. He was maybe 40, with features that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty etched into every line. A scar ran from his left ear to his chin, puckered and old. "Heard an interesting story a few weeks back. Heard that the great Elias Varn, the ghost of Silver Creek, the man who walked away from the Northfield massacre without a scratch, disarmed some young gunslinger twice. Got me thinking." "Thinking's dangerous for you, Marcus. Always has been." Marcus smiled, and it was like watching a skull grin. "Got me thinking that maybe the stories are true. Maybe you really did go soft. Maybe all these years playing farmer made you forget what you were." "I know exactly what I was." Elias shifted his weight slightly, and Rhett recognized the stance now, balanced, ready, every muscle prepared to move in any direction. "And I know what you are. Same angry boy I left behind 20 years ago, still trying to prove himself by hurting people." The scarred man spoke up from his horse. "We brought Marcus here to settle accounts, old man. You made us look like fools. Cost us money. Now we're going to take it out of your hide." "Is that what he told you?" Elias's eyes never left Marcus. "That this is about money? You poor, stupid bastards. He's using you. Same way he used everyone in the old days. You're just bodies to him, shields between him and what he's really afraid of." "Shut your mouth," Marcus snarled, his hand moving to his gun. "You don't get to talk about fear, not after you ran like a coward." "I didn't run. I walked away. There's a difference." "No difference I can see." Marcus drew his gun in one smooth motion, the barrel aimed directly at Elias's chest. The 4 hired men drew as well, 5 guns trained on one old man with a wooden stick. "You walked away from the life, from the brotherhood, from me, and now I'm here to collect on 20 years of insult." Inside the house, Rhett felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to run outside, to do something. His gun belt was in the barn, but there were kitchen knives, tools, anything he could use as a weapon. 5 against 2 were better odds than 5 against 1, but he'd promised Elias he'd stay inside, promised to trust him. It was the hardest promise he'd ever tried to keep. "You're making a mistake, Marcus," Elias said calmly. "I didn't come out here to live peaceful because I lost my edge. I came because I found something better than killing. But don't mistake peace for weakness. I can still do what needs doing if you force my hand." Big words from a man with 5 guns pointed at him. Marcus cocked his weapon. "Here's how this works. You get on your knees and beg. You apologize for abandoning us, for thinking you were better than the life. And if you beg real pretty, maybe I'll kill you quick instead of making it last." "No." The single word fell into the yard like a stone into still water. The hired men exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Old farmers were supposed to plead for their lives, not refuse impossible demands. Marcus's face darkened. "What did you say?" "I said no. I'm not begging, not apologizing, not getting on my knees." Elias adjusted his grip on the staff. "You want to shoot me? Shoot me. But we both know you didn't ride all this way just to put a bullet in an old man. You came because you need something from me. Need me to validate that the choice you made to stay in the life, to keep killing, was the right one. You don't know what I need. I know exactly what you need. Same thing that young gunslinger needed when he came here looking for a fight. Elias's voice gentled slightly. You need someone to tell you it's okay to be what you are, that the blood on your hands means something, that destroying yourself and everyone around you is strength instead of sickness. Marcus's gun hand trembled. Stop talking. Can't give you that, Marcus. Can't tell you the lie you want to hear. The life we lived, the things we did. They don't make us strong. They make us empty, hollow. You know it as well as I do. That's why you're really here. Not for revenge. For absolution you'll never get. I said stop talking, Marcus fired. The shot echoed across the farmyard, impossibly loud. Rhett's breath caught in his throat as he watched Elias move, or thought he saw him move. It happened so fast that his eyes couldn't track it properly. One moment, the old man was standing still. The next, he was 2 feet to the left, and the bullet meant for his chest had punched harmlessly into the dirt behind him. Marcus stared in disbelief. The hired men's horses spooked at the gunshot, dancing nervously. How? Marcus began. Elias was already moving. The staff spun in his hands, becoming a blur of motion. He closed the distance to Marcus in 3 impossibly fast strides and struck. The staff hit Marcus's gun hand with surgical precision, and the weapon went flying. Before Marcus could react, Elias swept his legs out from under him, dropping him hard into the dirt. The 4 hired men opened fire. Rhett pressed himself against the window frame, watching in horror as bullets tore through the air where Elias had been. But the old man wasn't there anymore. He'd rolled behind the water trough, using it as cover, moving with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone his age. "Spread out!" the scarred man shouted. "Flank him!" They dismounted and began advancing, using their horses as shields. This was a coordinated assault, professional and deadly. Elias was trapped behind the trough with nowhere to run and no cover that would hold against sustained fire. Rhett couldn't watch this anymore. Couldn't stay inside while the man who'd saved him died in the dirt. He ran for the barn, his feet pounding across the floorboards. His gun belt was where he'd left it, dusty and neglected. He grabbed it, strapped it on with shaking hands that remembered the motion despite weeks of disuse. The weight felt foreign now. Wrong. But he drew the Colt anyway and ran toward the door. "Don't!" Elias's voice stopped him cold. Rhett spun to find the old man standing in the barn doorway, completely unharmed. Behind him, in the yard, all 4 hired men lay on the ground, groaning and clutching various injuries. Marcus sat with his back against the water trough, his face a mask of shock and something that might have been tears. "How did you—" Rhett couldn't finish the question. Training, discipline. Understanding that real fighting ain't about shooting the most bullets. Elias walked past him and took the gun from his hands gently. It's about knowing where to be and where not to be, about reading your opponent and staying 3 moves ahead. You took down 5 armed men without a gun. Didn't need a gun. They were angry, frightened, working for money they didn't believe in. That makes them predictable. He set Rhett's gun on a hay bale. I told you to stay in the house. I couldn't just watch you die. I wasn't going to die, but I needed you to trust that. Needed you to understand that rushing into violence ain't always the answer, even when every part of you is screaming to fight. Elias studied him with those pale eyes. You did good, staying inside as long as you did, but you still reached for the gun in the end. Shame burned through Rhett. I know what you thought, and that's the problem. You still think violence is the solution, still believe that strength comes from the gun instead of from in here. He tapped Rhett's chest. We got more work to do. Outside, the hired men were slowly climbing to their feet, nursing bruises and what looked like a couple of dislocated joints. Elias walked among them with casual authority. You boys got a choice now, he said. You can ride out of here and find honest work, or you can try this again and discover I was being gentle this time. What's it gonna be? The scarred man spat blood into the dirt. You broke my damn arm. Dislocated your shoulder. It'll heal if you're smart about it. Elias helped him stand with surprising gentleness. There's a doctor in Red Hollow. Go see him. Tell him I sent you and he'll fix you up. Then get out of this territory and find a better way to make money. You're just letting us go? The lanky man with missing teeth seemed genuinely confused. Killing you won't teach you nothing. Living with the knowledge that you got beat by an old farmer with a stick. That might actually make you think about your choices. Elias gestured toward their horses. Go on, And tell anyone who asks that Elias Varn ain't an easy target. Might save some other fools the trouble of learning the hard way." They limped to their horses, moving like men twice their age. Within minutes, they were riding away, leaving only Marcus sitting against the water trough. Elias approached him slowly and sat down beside him in the dust. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Marcus laughed. A broken, bitter sound. 20 years, he said. 20 years I've been telling myself you were a coward, that you ran because you were afraid. I was afraid, Elias replied quietly. Just not of dying. I was afraid of what I was becoming. Afraid that if I kept on that path, I'd lose the last piece of myself that was worth saving. And did you save it? Some days I think so. Other days I'm not sure there was anything worth saving to begin with. Elias picked up a handful of dirt and let it run through his fingers. But I keep trying, keep working, keep hoping that maybe the man I am today is better than the man I was yesterday. Marcus turned to look at him, and Rhett could see tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. I don't know how to be anything else. Don't know how to stop. I know. That's why I didn't kill you. Elias stood and offered his hand. You can stay here, work the farm, learn what I learned, or you can ride out and keep being what you are until someone faster or smarter puts you down. Your choice. Marcus stared at the offered hand for a long time. Then he shook his head and climbed to his feet without help. Can't stay. Too much blood between us, too much history. He walked to his horse, moving like a man carrying a terrible weight. But maybe I'll think about what you said, about there being something better. That's all anyone can ask. Elias watched him mount up. Take care of yourself, Marcus. And if you ever decide you're tired of running from yourself, my door's open. Marcus nodded once and rode away, disappearing into the gathering dusk. When he was gone, Elias turned to Rhett, who still stood in the barn doorway. You saw what just happened? Yeah. Rhett's voice was rough. What did you learn from it? Rhett thought carefully before answering. That violence don't always solve things. That sometimes the strongest thing you can do is offer someone a way out instead of putting them down. Good. But there's more. Elias walked toward him. You also learned that real skill, real mastery, comes from discipline and practice. Those men were armed and I wasn't, but I was never in real danger because I've spent decades training my body and mind to work together. The gun is just a tool. Without the discipline behind it, it's worthless. Will you teach me? The words came out before Rhett could stop them. The way you move, the way you fight, will you teach me that? Elias was quiet for a moment. Why do you want to learn? Because, Rhett struggled to find the words. Because I want to be strong the way you're strong. Not because people are afraid of me, but because I'm in control of myself. Because I can choose when to fight and when to walk away. That's a good reason. Elias nodded slowly. But understand, what I'll teach you ain't about becoming a better fighter. It's about becoming a better person. The fighting is just a tool for teaching discipline, control, awareness. You willing to accept that? Yes. Then starting tomorrow, we add training to your daily work. But the work comes first, always. We wake before dawn, handle the chores, then train for 2 hours before breakfast. After breakfast, more work. After dinner, more training. It'll be harder than anything you've done so far. I can handle it. We'll see. Elias started toward the house, then paused. And Rhett, you did good today. Staying inside took more courage than running out here with a gun would have. Remember that. That night, lying on his cot, Rhett replayed the day's events in his mind. He'd watched Elias take down 5 armed men without breaking a sweat, had seen true mastery in action, and more importantly, he'd seen mercy. Elias could have killed Marcus, could have killed all of them. Instead, he'd offered them the same choice he'd offered Rhett, the chance to become something better. That was real strength, not the kind that came from fear or reputation or the fastest draw, but the kind that came from knowing who you were and what you stood for, and having the discipline to act accordingly. Sleep came easier that night than it had in weeks. The next morning, true to his word, Elias woke him in the pre-dawn darkness. They handled the morning chores in silence, feeding animals, collecting eggs, checking fence lines. Then, as the sun began to paint the horizon in shades of gold and pink, Elias led him to an open area behind the barn. First lesson, the the old man said, picking up 2 wooden staffs. He tossed one to Rhett. Balance. Everything in fighting, everything in life comes down to balance. Physical, mental, emotional. You learn to maintain your balance no matter what's happening around you. You've learned the foundation of everything else. For the next 2 hours, Elias put him through exercises that looked simple but proved devastatingly difficult. Standing on one leg while the old man tried to push him over, moving through slow, deliberate forms that required perfect weight distribution, breathing techniques that were supposed to center his mind but mostly just made him dizzy. By breakfast, Rhett was already exhausted, but there was no rest. After they ate, it was back to the fields for planting. The work was familiar now, his body knowing the rhythms even as it screamed in protest. They worked through the heat of midday, pausing only for water and brief rests. Then, after dinner, more training. This time, Elias taught him how to fall without getting hurt, how to roll and recover, how to use an opponent's momentum against them. Rhett hit the ground so many times he lost count, each impact driving home how little he actually knew about real combat, despite all his years as a gunslinger. The gun makes you lazy, Elias explained as he helped Rhett up for the 20th time. Makes you think pointing and pulling a trigger is the same as fighting. But real combat is about reading your opponent, staying calm under pressure, adapting to changing circumstances. A gun can't teach you that. How long did it take you to learn all this? Still learning? Every day I discover something new about my limits and how to push past them. Elias demonstrated a throw, moving with that impossible fluidity. The difference between a master and a student ain't knowledge. It's accepting that you'll never know everything and staying humble enough to keep learning. The days blurred together into a new rhythm. Wake before dawn, chores, training, work, training, sleep. Repeat. Rhett's body transformed, building lean muscle and functional strength that had nothing to do with looking dangerous. His hands, once soft except for the calluses from holding a gun, became tough as leather from farm work. His reflexes, always quick, became sharper and more precise. But more than his body changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his mind began to shift. The constant anger that had driven him for so long started to fade, replaced by something calmer and more focused. He found satisfaction in small accomplishments. A fence mended well, a field planted straight, a defensive technique finally executed properly. Weeks turned into months. Summer's heat gave way to autumn's cooling temperatures. The crops they'd planted began to ripen, transforming the fields into waves of gold and green. Rhett found himself actually caring about the harvest, worrying about rain and pests, and all the mundane concerns of farming that would have seemed ridiculous to his old self. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, Elias spoke quietly. "You've come a long way. From the angry boy who rode in here wanting to kill me to the man sitting beside me now. You should be proud of that." "Don't feel like I've come far enough." Rhett studied his hands in the fading light. "Still feel like the old me is waiting under the surface, like one wrong moment and I'll be right back where I started." The feeling never goes away completely. The person you were, the things you did, they're part of you forever. Can't erase them, can't pretend they didn't happen. Elias leaned back in his chair. But you can choose every single day to be someone different, to let those experiences teach you instead of define you. What if I fail? What if someone pushes the wrong button and I just snap? Then you pick yourself up and try again. That's all any of us can do. He turned to look at Rhett. You ain't going to be perfect. Nobody is. But you're trying, and that's what matters. That's what separates people who change from people who just talk about changing. A rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Rhett's hand moved instinctively toward his hip, a reflex that was hard to break. But his gun wasn't there, hadn't been there for months now. Elias stood, his posture alert but not alarmed. Recognize that horse? Rhett squinted into the setting sun. Looks like Jack Reeves. Indeed, the Red Hollow lawman galloped into the yard and dismounted quickly, his face grim. Elias, Rhett, we got a problem. What kind of problem? Elias asked. The Garrett brothers rolled into town this morning with about a dozen men. They're tearing the place apart, robbing stores, terrorizing folks. They heard stories about you. He nodded to Rhett. Heard you'd gone soft. Figured they'd make their reputation by taking over your territory. Rhett felt ice settle in his stomach. The Garrett brothers were infamous, 3 siblings who'd built their reputation on brutality and casual violence. If they were in Red Hollow, people would die. Why come to us? Rhett asked. You're the law. Because I'm one man against 15, and they made it clear they'll kill anyone who stands against them. Reeves looked desperate. I need help. The town needs help. I know I turned you down before, Rhett, but things are different now. Will you ride with me? Rhett looked at Elias, silently asking the question he couldn't voice. The old man studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Go, Elias said quietly. But remember what you've learned. Remember that strength ain't about how many men you can kill. It's about protecting what matters. Come with me, Rhett said. We can face them together. No, this is something you need to do yourself. Need to prove to yourself that you can walk into danger without becoming the man you used to be. Elias gripped his shoulder. Trust your training. Trust yourself. And remember, there's always a choice between violence and mercy. Make sure you're making the right one. Rhett went to the barn and retrieved his gun belt, dusty from months of neglect. He strapped it on, feeling its familiar weight settle around his hips. But it felt different now. Not like an extension of himself, but like a tool, something to be used carefully and only when necessary. He mounted Prophet, who stamped eagerly, ready to run. Reeves climbed back onto his own horse. Thank you, the lawman said. I know this ain't easy for you. It's necessary, Rhett replied. That makes it easy. They rode hard for Red Hollow, the last light of day fading behind them. And as the darkness gathered, Rhett felt a strange calm settle over him. He was riding toward danger, toward violence, toward everything he'd spent months trying to leave behind. But he wasn't the same person anymore. He'd learned discipline, control, and most importantly, that there was more than one way to be strong. Whatever waited for him in Red Hollow, he'd face it not as Rhett Callahan the Gunslinger, but as the man Elias Varn had helped him become. They reached Red Hollow just after full dark, the town lit by scattered lanterns and the orange glow of a fire someone had started in the street. Rhett could hear shouting, breaking glass, the sharp crack of gunfire. Prophet danced nervously beneath him, sensing the violence ahead. They're at the saloon, Reeves said, pulling his horse to a stop at the edge of town. Started there this afternoon and haven't left, using it as their base while the rest of them shake down businesses. Rhett studied the scene, his mind working differently than it would have months ago. The old Rhett would have charged in, guns blazing, overwhelming force meeting overwhelming force. But Elias had taught him to think, to assess, to find the path that minimized harm. How many inside the saloon? The 3 Garrett brothers and maybe 4 others. The rest are scattered around town. Reeves's voice was tight with fear barely controlled. Cole Garrett is the worst of them. Oldest brother. He's the one calling the shots. Anyone hurt yet? Old Samuel took a beating when he refused to open his store. Doc's with him now. And Jenny? Reeves's voice cracked slightly. Jenny's in the saloon. They grabbed her when this started. Rhett felt anger flare in his chest, hot and familiar. Jenny had shown him kindness when no one else would. The thought of the Garrett brothers putting their hands on her made something dark rise up inside him. But then he heard Elias's voice in his head. There's always a choice between violence and mercy. Make sure you're making the right one. He took a slow breath, the way Elias had taught him. Let the anger exist, acknowledged it, but didn't let it control him. I'm going in alone, he said. That's suicide. There's 7 armed men in there. I know, that's why you're staying out here. Rhett dismounted and checked his gun, still loaded, still clean despite months of neglect. Muscle memory took over as he did a practice draw, and the Colt came out smooth and fast. His hands were harder now, calloused from work, but the speed was still there. Rhett, I can't let you... You asked for my help. This is how I help. He started walking toward the saloon, then paused and looked back. If I'm not out in 20 minutes, assume I failed and get help from somewhere else. Don't come in after me. Why are you doing this? Rhett thought about that question as he approached the saloon's batwing doors. Why was he walking into a situation where he'd likely die? The old Rhett would have said it was about reputation, about proving he wasn't soft. But that man had been dying slowly over the past months, replaced by someone who understood that some things were worth protecting even at great cost. He was doing this because Red Hollow didn't deserve to suffer. Because Jenny deserved better than being used as leverage by men who saw people as things. Because someone had to stand up, and he'd spent too many years being the one people needed standing up against. The saloon doors swung open under his push. 7 men looked up from various positions around the room. 3 sat at a table near the bar. The Garrett brothers, unmistakable in their similarity. All 3 had the same hard eyes, the same cruel mouths, the same casual violence in their postures. The other 4 were scattered around, drinking and laughing, and in the corner, tied to a chair with a gag in her mouth, was Jenny. Her dress was torn, her face bruised. When she saw Rhett, her eyes went wide. Well. The man in the center of the 3 brothers stood slowly. Cole Garrett had to be. Older than his siblings by maybe 5 years, with silver threading through his dark hair. Look what wandered in, boys. The famous Rhett Callahan. Heard you turned into a farmer. Rhett let the doors swing shut behind him. Heard you were terrorizing people who can't fight back. Sounds about your speed. Cole smiled, and it was like looking at a mirror of who Rhett used to be. All performance and threat, nothing beneath but emptiness trying to fill itself with fear. Big talk from a man who's outnumbered 7-1. I count different. Looks like 7 cowards to 1 man. The room went quiet. One of the brothers, the youngest, with a patchy beard and nervous eyes, laughed uncertainly. He's got balls, Cole. Gotta give him that. Had balls, Cole corrected. Past tense. He spread his arms wide in a gesture of false welcome. Here's how this works, Callahan. You can turn around and walk out of here, go back to your farming or whatever pathetic thing you've been doing. Or you can try to be a hero, and we'll kill you, rape your friend here, and burn this whole town to the ground just to make a point. Your choice. Rhett's hand hovered near his gun, but he didn't draw, not yet. There's a third option. Oh? What's that? You let the girl go. You and your men leave Red Hollow tonight and never come back. And in exchange, I don't kill all of you. The silence lasted 2 heartbeats. Then the entire room erupted in laughter. Even Cole grinned, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. You don't kill all of us? Son, you might have been something once, but you've been playing farmer too long. Lost your edge, lost your nerve. Cole's hand moved to his gun. I'm going to give you one more chance to walk out of here before I... Rhett drew. The old speed was still there, buried under months of plowing and fence mending, but never truly gone. His hand flashed to his holster, the Colt cleared leather, and he fired once. The shot took the gun out of Cole's hand before the older man had even touched his grip. The room froze. Cole stared at his empty, stinging hand in disbelief. Next one goes through your skull, Rhett said quietly, his gun now trained on Cole's forehead. Now, let's try this again. Let the girl go. The other 6 men reached for their weapons, but Rhett's voice stopped them. Don't. First man who clears leather, your boss dies. I might not get all of you, but I guarantee I get him. That what you want? The youngest brother spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. Cole, maybe we should... Shut up, Danny. Cole's face had gone red with humiliation and rage. You think one quick draw changes the math here? You can't shoot all of us. No, Rhett admitted. But I don't need to shoot all of you. Just need to shoot the right ones. He'd learned this from Elias. Not the shooting, but the psychology. These men weren't a unified group. They were individuals held together by fear of their leader and greed for easy money. Break the leader, and the rest might fold. Here's what's going to happen, Rhett continued, his voice calm despite his racing heart. Cole's going to tell one of you to untie the girl. She's going to walk out of here. Then you're all going to leave town. Tonight. Right now. And if we don't? Cole asked through gritted teeth. Then I start shooting, and we see how many of you die before you put me down. Your choice. But ask yourself, is whatever you hope to gain here worth dying for? For a long moment, nobody moved. Rhett could see the calculation happening behind Cole's eyes, weighing his pride against survival. These were the kinds of men who'd spent their lives bullying those weaker than them, but they'd also survived by knowing when to fold. Cole looked around at his men, saw the uncertainty in their faces, and made his decision. Danny, untie the girl. But Cole, do it. The youngest brother moved slowly to Jenny's chair and began working at the ropes. His hands shook as he fumbled with the knots, very aware of the gun still pointed at his brother's head. Smart choice, Rhett said, but inside his mind was racing. This was the easy part. Getting Jenny out was step one. What came after would be harder. Jenny stumbled as the ropes fell away, pulling the gag from her mouth. She looked at Rhett with a mixture of gratitude and terror, understanding that this situation was balanced on a knife's edge. Walk to the door, Rhett told her. Slow. Don't run. When you get outside, find Jack Reeves and stay with him. She moved past him, giving the armed men wide berth. Every step seemed to take forever. When she finally pushed through the doors and disappeared into the night, Rhett felt a small measure of relief. One person safe. Now to handle the rest. She's gone, Cole said, his voice dripping with barely suppressed rage. We kept our end. Now lower that gun and walk away. Can't do that. Rhett's aim never wavered. You still need to leave town. You got what you wanted. The girl's safe. Don't push your luck. This ain't about luck. It's about making sure you understand that Red Hollow is off limits, that you can't just ride into towns and terrorize people without consequences. Cole laughed bitterly. Consequences? From you? The man who spent years doing exactly what we're doing? Don't act righteous with me, Callahan. We're the same, you and I. Only difference is, you got soft. You're right, Rhett said, and meant it. We are the same, or were. That's how I know what you're thinking right now. Know that you're looking for an opening, calculating odds, trying to figure out if your reputation can survive backing down to one man. Then you know how this ends. Yeah, it ends with you making a choice. Same choice I had to make. Rhett's voice softened slightly. You can keep being what you are, a man who hurts people because it's all you know how to do, until someone faster or smarter puts you in the ground. Or you can walk away, find something better, something that don't eat you alive from the inside. What the hell are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you hate yourself, that you know what you're doing is wrong, but you keep doing it because you don't know what else to be. I'm talking about the nights when you can't sleep, when all the faces of the people you've hurt parade through your head and you try to drown them with whiskey. Rhett took a step forward, his gun still steady. I'm talking about the fact that there's a way out, if you're brave enough to take it. Cole's face twisted with emotion, anger, shame, something that might have been longing. You don't know anything about me. I know everything about you. Because I was you. For a moment, something shifted in Cole's eyes. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that Rhett was speaking truth. Then the middle brother moved. He'd been slowly inching his hand toward his gun during the conversation, hoping Rhett wouldn't notice. Now he made his play, drawing fast and firing wildly. The bullet went wide, punching into the wall beside Rhett's head. Rhett's body reacted before his mind caught up, months of training with Elias combining with years of gunfighting instinct. He dove to the side, rolled, came up firing. His shot took the middle brother in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun clattering across the floor. Then everything exploded into chaos. The other men drew their weapons. Rhett moved, his body flowing through the defensive patterns Elias had drilled into him. He wasn't trying to kill anymore. Elias's teachings ran too deep for that. Instead, he aimed for hands, shoulders, legs, disabling shots that would stop the threat without taking lives. The saloon filled with gun smoke and the deafening roar of firearms. A bullet grazed Rhett's left arm, burning like a brand. Another shattered a bottle beside his head, showering him with glass and whiskey. He fired, moved, fired again. His count was automatic. 3 shots left, 2, 1. He ejected the spent shells with one hand while diving behind the bar, his other hand already pulling fresh rounds from his belt. The reload was smooth, practiced, completed in seconds. He came up firing, catching another man in the thigh and dropping him. But there were still too many. Even wounded, Cole's men kept coming, their return fire forcing Rhett to keep moving, keep dodging. This was exactly the kind of fight he'd tried to avoid, pure violence with no room for mercy or choice. Then the saloon doors burst open. Elias Varn walked in carrying his staff, his face calm as a mountain lake. Behind him came Jack Reeves with a shotgun, and behind Reeves were a dozen townspeople armed with whatever they could grab, rifles, pistols, farming tools. Seems like you could use some help, Elias said mildly, as if commenting on the weather. The sight of the old man somehow shifted everything. The remaining Garrett men, seeing reinforcements arrive, began to falter. Cole, clutching his hand where Rhett's bullet had struck it, looked around at his bleeding, demoralized crew and made the calculation. "Fall back," he shouted. "Out the back!" They scrambled for the rear exit, half running, half limping. Reeves moved to pursue, but Elias stopped him with a raised hand. "Let them go. They're beaten." "They'll just come back," Reeves argued. "No, they won't." Elias looked at Rhett, a question in his eyes. Rhett holstered his gun and walked to the back door. Through it, he could see Cole and his men mounting their horses in the alley, preparing to flee. He called out before they could ride away. "Cole!" The older man turned, his face a mask of pain and shame. "You asked me what I'm talking about," Rhett said. "I'm talking about the fact that it don't have to be this way, that there's a farm about 5 miles east of here where an old man will teach you how to be something other than what you are. If you ever get tired of running from yourself, you know where to find him." Cole stared at him for a long moment. Then he wheeled his horse around and galloped into the darkness, his brothers and men following. Silence fell over the saloon, broken only by the groans of wounded men and the settling of dust. Rhett became aware of pain in his left arm where the bullet had grazed him, blood running warm down to his elbow. "You're hurt," Elias said, moving to examine the wound. "It's nothing." But Rhett's hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "I tried to do it your way, tried not to kill anyone." "I saw." "You did good." Elias tore a strip from his shirt and began wrapping Rhett's arm. "Could have killed all of them easy, would have been justified, but you chose the harder path." "Doesn't feel like I chose anything, feels like I barely survived." "That's because you're still learning, still figuring out how to balance what you were with what you want to be." The old man tied off the bandage. "That fight wasn't perfect, wasn't clean. You got hurt, could have gotten killed. But you didn't let yourself become the monster you used to be. That matters." Jack Reeves approached, his shotgun still in hand. "The town owes you both." "That took more courage than I got." "Courage had nothing to do with it," Rhett said tiredly. "I just didn't know what else to do." Jenny appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with tears. She ran to Rhett and threw her arms around him, not caring about the blood or the impropriety. "You came back. After everything, you came back." "Couldn't leave you with them." He awkwardly patted her shoulder, unsure how to handle gratitude that felt undeserved. "You all right?" "I am now." She pulled back, studying his face. "You're different. Something about you is different." "Yeah, well, had a good teacher." He looked at Elias, who was helping one of the wounded Garrett men, the youngest one, Danny, sit up and examine his injury. "You'll live," Elias told the young man, "but you need to make better choices about who you ride with." Danny, who couldn't have been more than 20, nodded miserably. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. Cole said it would be easy money, that we'd be in and out before anyone could stop us." "There's no such thing as easy money. Only money that costs you more than it's worth." Elias helped him stand. "You got family somewhere? Someone who'd take you in if you left this life?" "Got a sister in Kansas, married to a homesteader. She's been asking me to come help with their farm." "Then go to her, tonight, before Cole decides he needs his crew back and comes looking." Elias pressed something into the young man's hand. Money, Rhett realized. Enough for a train ticket and then some. "Tell her you're done with the old ways. Tell her you want to learn how to do honest work." Danny stared at the money, then at Elias. "Why? Why help me after what we did?" "Because someone helped me once. And because you're young enough that you might actually listen." Elias turned him toward the door. "Go, before I change my mind." They watched the young man limp away into the night, headed for the train station. Reeves shook his head in amazement. "You're a strange man, Elias Varn. Most folks would have shot him." "Most folks aren't trying to be better than they were yesterday." Elias looked around at the assembled townspeople. "This town's got some healing to do, but you'll manage. You're tougher than you give yourself credit for." Over the next hour, they helped clean up the saloon, tended to the wounded, and restored some semblance of order to Red Hollow. Old Samuel was bruised, but alive, already talking about getting back to his store in the morning. The other businesses had been damaged, but not destroyed. And most importantly, no one had died. As the town settled back into an uneasy peace, Rhett found himself standing in the street outside the saloon, staring at his hands. They were still shaking slightly, adrenaline refusing to fully leave his system. Jenny approached quietly. "You should let the doc look at that arm. It's fine." "You're always saying things are fine when they're not." She stood beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel her presence. "Thank you for coming back, for risking your life. I owed this town, owed you." He flexed his injured arm, testing the range of motion. "Did a lot of terrible things here when I first rode in. Figured I should do at least one good thing before I left." "You leaving again?" "Yeah, got work waiting at the farm. Fields don't plow themselves." She was quiet for a moment. "You really changed, didn't you? This isn't an act. Isn't you pretending to be someone you're not?" "I don't know what I am anymore," he admitted. "Some days I feel like I'm becoming someone better. Other days I feel like I'm one bad moment away from being exactly who I was. But I keep trying. That's all I know how to do." "That's more than most people manage." She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. "Take care of yourself, Rhett Callahan. And come visit sometime when you're not being shot at." She walked away, and Rhett touched his cheek where she'd kissed him, feeling something warm and unfamiliar in his chest. Hope, maybe. Or the beginning of believing he might actually deserve kindness. Elias emerged from the saloon and stood beside him. "Ready to go home?" Home. The word hit Rhett strangely. When had the farm become home? When had any place felt like more than just another stop on an endless ride? "Yeah," he said. "I'm ready." They rode back through the darkness, neither speaking much. The adrenaline had fully drained from Rhett's system now, leaving him exhausted and aching. His arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed it. His ears still rang from the gunfire. But underneath the pain and fatigue, he felt something else. Not pride exactly, but satisfaction. He'd walked into danger and come out the other side without becoming the monster he used to be. Had protected people without killing anyone. Had offered mercy even to those who didn't deserve it. That had to count for something. Back at the farm, Elias tended to Rhett's wound properly, cleaning it and applying a salve that smelled terrible but eased the burning. Then they sat on the porch as they'd done so many nights before, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. "You handled yourself well tonight," Elias said finally. "Wasn't perfect, but nothing ever is. What matters is you stayed true to what you've been learning. I got lucky. If you and Reeves hadn't shown up when you did, luck's part of it, sure. But you made your own luck by choosing not to kill, by giving Cole and his men a reason to run instead of fight to the death." Elias pulled out his pipe and began packing it with tobacco. "When I told you to go alone, I wasn't expecting you to win through force. I was hoping you'd win by being smarter, by finding the path that didn't require everyone dying. Why didn't you just come with me from the start?" "Because you needed to prove to yourself that you could handle it, that the things I taught you weren't just exercises, but tools you could actually use when it mattered." He lit the pipe, the flame briefly illuminating his weathered face. "And because I needed to know if I'd actually taught you anything, or if I was just fooling myself that people can change. What's the verdict? You can change? You have changed. But you ain't done changing, and you never will be. That's what being human means, constantly becoming, never quite arriving." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crickets in the fields and the occasional rustle of wind through the corn. "What happens now?" Rhett asked eventually. "Now you keep working, keep learning, keep choosing to be better than you were yesterday." Elias blew a smoke ring that dissolved into the night. "And maybe, when you feel ready, you start teaching others what you've learned. Pass it on, the way Samuel passed it to me, the way I passed it to you." "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "Nobody ever is. But that's okay. Being ready ain't the point, trying is the point." The weeks turned into months again, and the months into a full year. The crops they'd planted were harvested, sold, and new crops were planted in their place. Winter came with its frozen silence, and Rhett spent long nights in the farmhouse learning to read from Elias's small collection of books. Spring returned with its promise of renewal, and they worked the fields again under warming sun. Rhett's body had fully transformed now. The lean, whipcord strength of a gunslinger had been replaced by the solid, functional muscle of a working man. His hands were so calloused that he could grab a hot pot handle without flinching. His face had weathered, lines forming around his eyes from squinting into sun and distance. More importantly, something inside him had settled. The constant anger that had driven him for so long had quieted to a low murmur, manageable and contained. He still had bad days, still felt the pull of old habits and violent solutions. But they were fewer now, and when they came, he had the tools to work through them. One spring morning, as they were mending fence on the eastern boundary, Rhett saw a rider approaching. His hand moved toward his hip by reflex, but his gun wasn't there. Hadn't been there for months except when locked in a chest in the barn. The rider was young, maybe 18, with the kind of swagger that Rhett recognized immediately. Another angry boy playing at being a man, looking for someone to hurt to prove his worth. Elias saw him too and smiled slightly. "Looks familiar, don't he?" "Yeah." Rhett set down his hammer. "Want me to handle this?" "I think you should." The young rider pulled up about 20 feet away and called out, "One of you Elias Varn?" "I am," the old man replied. "Heard stories about you. Heard you used to be something before you went soft." The kid's hand rested on his gun. "Figured I'd come see for myself if the stories are true." Rhett stepped forward before Elias could respond. "They're true. He used to be something. Now he's something better. Question is, you smart enough to learn from that? Or you gonna make the same mistakes I did?" The kid's eyes shifted to Rhett, sizing him up. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who used to be just like you. Angry, stupid, convinced that hurting people made me strong." Rhett moved closer, his body language open and non-threatening despite the words. "Rode into this farm planning to kill this man. Instead, he taught me that real strength ain't about how scared you can make people. It's about controlling yourself instead of trying to control everyone else." "That's a nice speech, but I didn't ride all this way for a philosophy lesson." "Then why did you ride here?" Elias asked gently. "If you just wanted to kill someone, there's easier targets than an old farmer and his hired hand. So why here? Why me?" The kid's face worked through several expressions: defiance, confusion, and finally something that might have been desperation. "I heard you could teach me to be better, to be like you were." "I can teach you to be better," Elias agreed, "but not like I was. Like I am now. That what you want?" A long silence, then barely audible. "I don't know what I want, just know I can't keep being what I am." Rhett and Elias exchanged glances. The old man nodded slightly. "What's your name, son?" Rhett asked. Carter Mills." "Well, Carter Mills, you got a choice to make. You can ride out of here and keep being whatever it is you think you need to be. Or you can stay, work harder than you've ever worked in your life, and maybe, learn how to be someone different." Rhett gestured to the fence. "Fair warning, it ain't glamorous. It's plowing fields and mending fences and learning that strength comes from doing the work nobody sees and nobody thanks you for." Carter looked between them, his young face uncertain. "And if I stay? What then?" "Then you become one more link in a chain that goes back farther than either of us know," Elias said. "Someone saved me. I saved him." He nodded at Rhett. "He saves you, and someday when you've learned what you need to learn, you save someone else. That's how it works. That's how good spreads in a world that's got plenty of bad already." The kid sat on his horse for what felt like forever. Then he dismounted and tied his reins to the fence post. "What do I do first?" "First, you take off that gun belt and put it somewhere safe. Won't need it for the work we're doing." Elias handed him a hammer. "Then you help us finish this fence line. We'll talk about everything else after." Rhett watched Carter fumble with the fence wire, making mistakes that would need correcting, learning the hard way like everyone did. And he felt something settle even deeper in his chest, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with fear or reputation or being the fastest gun. This was what mattered, not the dramatic moments, not the gunfights or the showdowns, but the quiet work of helping someone find a better path. The patient teaching that might save a life not by taking others, but by showing that there was more to being alive than violence and emptiness. That evening, as the three of them sat on the porch eating the simple meal Elias had prepared, Rhett looked out at the fields he'd helped plant and tend. Somewhere in Red Hollow, people were living their lives free from fear because he'd chosen not to become the monster he used to be. Somewhere in Kansas, a young man named Danny was learning to farm with his sister, building something instead of destroying it. And here on this porch, another lost boy was getting his first real meal of the road to becoming someone better. It wasn't the legacy Rhett had imagined building when he was young and stupid and thought reputation was everything. But it was real, and it mattered, and it would outlast any fear he could have ever created. "You look thoughtful," Elias observed, "just thinking about how far I've come. From the man who rode into Red Hollow looking to hurt someone to this." Rhett gestured vaguely at himself, at the farm, at everything. "Still doesn't feel real sometimes." "It's real. You made it real by choosing it every day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard." The old man stood and stretched, his joints popping. "I'm getting too old for this. One of these days, this farm is going to need someone younger to run it." "You planning on going somewhere?" "Planning on dying eventually. Can't avoid it forever." Elias said it matter-of-factly, without fear. "When I do, the farm goes to you. It's in my will, such as it is. Figure you've earned it." Rhett felt his throat tighten. None of us deserve the second chances we get. But we get them anyway, and what we do with them is what matters." Elias gripped his shoulder. "You'll do right by this place. I know you will. And you'll keep teaching whoever shows up needing to learn. That's the legacy. Not the land, not the buildings, the teaching." "I'll try. That's all anyone can do." Years passed. Carter Mills stayed for 2 years, learning everything Rhett and Elias could teach him, then left to start his own farm in Wyoming. He wrote occasionally, letters full of hard-won wisdom and gratitude. Other young men came and went, some staying longer than others, all of them carrying forward lessons about strength and discipline and choosing to be better than their worst instincts. Elias Varn died in his sleep one winter night, peacefully and without fanfare, the way he'd wanted. They buried him on the hill overlooking the farm, under a simple marker that said only his name and the dates. Rhett spoke no eulogy at the grave. Elias wouldn't have wanted flowery words. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you for teaching me that being strong don't mean being feared. Rest easy, old man. I'll take it from here." And he did. Rhett Callahan, once the most feared gunslinger in 3 territories, the man whose name had meant death and terror, became known instead as a fair but demanding teacher who could help angry young men find better paths. His reputation spread slowly, carried by those he'd taught and those they taught in turn. He never married Jenny, though she visited often, and they remained close friends until her own death of old age decades later. He never stopped working the farm, never stopped teaching, never stopped choosing every single day to be someone other than the monster he'd once been. The gun that had defined him for so long stayed locked in a chest in the barn, cleaned and oiled but never fired except once a year on the anniversary of the day he'd first arrived at Elias's farm. On that day, Rhett would take it out, do a practice draw to prove he could still do it, then lock it away again. A reminder of what he'd been and what he'd chosen not to be. On his 60th birthday, a young woman rode up to the farm. She was maybe 20, with hard eyes and a gun on her hip, and that familiar combination of anger and desperation that Rhett had learned to recognize. "You Rhett Callahan?" she asked without preamble. "I am." "Heard you teach people. Heard you can show them how to be something other than what they are." "I can try. No promises it'll work, but I can try." He studied her carefully. "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Cross." The name hit him like a punch. Cross. Samuel Cross. The man who'd saved Elias, starting a chain that led to Rhett and everyone he'd helped since. "Any relation to Samuel Cross?" he asked. "My great-grandfather. He died before I was born, but my grandmother told me stories about him. About how he saved some angry gunslinger and sent him down a different path." She dismounted and stood before him, young and scared and trying hard not to show it. "Grandmother said if I ever got lost, if I ever needed help finding my way, I should look for the people my great-grandfather saved. Said they'd remember the debt and pay it forward." Rhett felt the weight of history settling around him, the circle completing itself in ways he never could have imagined. Samuel Cross had saved Elias. Elias had saved him, and now Samuel's own blood had come seeking the same salvation. "Your great-grandfather was a good man," Rhett said quietly. "Saved my teacher, and my teacher saved me. Guess that means I owe your family more than I can ever repay." I'm not looking for repayment, just looking for a chance." "Then you've come to the right place." He gestured toward the fields, green and growing under the summer sun. "Fair warning, though, this ain't easy. Gonna work you harder than you've ever been worked. Gonna tear down who you think you are and help you build something better. You ready for that?" Sarah looked at the farm, at the barn, at the simple house where smoke rose from the chimney. Then she looked at Rhett, really looked, and seemed to see past the weathered face and work-roughened hands to the truth underneath, that he'd walked the same path she was on and found his way through to the other side. "I'm ready," she said. "Good. Then let's get started." As they walked toward the barn to put up her horse, Rhett thought about the long chain of grace that had brought him to this moment. Samuel Cross reaching out to a lost young man named Elias. Elias reaching out to Rhett. Rhett reaching out to Carter and a dozen others. And now Sarah, carrying the blood of the man who'd started it all, coming full circle to receive the same gift her great-grandfather had given. This was the legacy that mattered. Not reputation or fear or being the fastest gun, but the quiet work of saving one person at a time, knowing that each person saved might save another, and another, spreading out like ripples on a pond until the whole world was touched by one old man's decision to show mercy instead of delivering the judgment that was deserved. The sun was setting as they finished putting Sarah's horse in a stall. Tomorrow would bring work, hard, endless, character-building work. But tonight, Rhett made a simple supper and told her the story of how he'd come to this farm, of the man who'd taught him, and the long line of teachers stretching back through time. And as Sarah listened, her hard eyes softening with something that might have been hope, Rhett understood finally what Elias had tried to tell him all those years ago. Being strong wasn't about conquering others. It was about conquering yourself. About choosing every day to be better than your worst instincts. About passing on what you'd learned so that the next generation didn't have to make the same mistakes. The legend of Rhett Callahan. The gunslinger faded from memory as the years passed. But the legend of Rhett Callahan, the teacher, the man who helped lost souls find their way, that legend lived on in the lives he touched, and the lives they touched in turn. And in the end, that was the only kind of legend worth having.